Привіт! Це подкаст «Коли все має значення». Мене звати Наталка Гуменюк, а зі мною
Ангеліна Карякіна. Всім привіт! І ми говоримо про чергового гостя Наталки і чергового журналіста відомого Крістіана Керола. Наталка, за яких обставин ти його знайшла, з ним познайомилась? Чим він цікавий нашій аудиторії?
Це дуже формальне знайомство. Крістіан Caryl був моїм редактором в розділі «Думки» на Washington Post в 2022 році напередодні Великої війни, і упродовж першого року я дописувала до Washington Post. Власне, він був моїм редактором. Ми не бачилися особисто, ми просто працювали. Він був редактором рубрики «Думки». Потім вже за якийсь рік, коли я потрапила вперше в Сполучені Штати після Великого вторгнення, ми познайомилися, і він дійсно був небайдужою людиною. Він давав місце, скажімо, і українським голосам. Додам, що колись ми робили, наприклад, покази фільмів The Reckoning Project про воєнні злочини в Вашингтоні. Я запрошувала його модератором. Але зараз він вже не працює в виданні, він зараз працює над книжками, але приїхав в Україну, де проводить певний час не тільки для журналістської роботи, але також читає кілька курсів в Київській школі економіки. Він не постійно тут, але, що головне, нам дуже пощастило всім з цим гостем, тому що вже зараз час говорити про вибори у Сполучених Штатах, зокрема і в контексті України, питання українського під час цих виборів, в контексті американської підтримки і взагалі кампанії, очікувань, тону цих відносин між американським істеблішментом, Україною, медіа. І, здається, це найкраща кандидатура саме розповісти не просто в цьому ключі. Далі я інформую, що я особисто зараз дописую з тобою цю розмову і буквально через кілька годин сідаю на потяг, потім на літак і буду вже працювати на американських виборах. Але то буде більш внутрішня історія. А ось тут якраз було цікаво поговорити про вибори в Сполучених Штатах з людиною, яка зі Сполучених Штатів, але перебуває в Україні. Тобто це не тільки про Америку, а й про Україну в цих виборах.
Дивись, наскільки взагалі вдячна ця справа робити прогнози по американських виборах в ситуації, коли Камала Гарріс і Дональд Трамп ідуть фактично ноздря в ноздрю. Про що тут можна говорити?
А ми не говорили про прогнози. Я думаю, я матиму шанс про це говорити вже пізніше. Ми, власне, говорили, чи насправді є загрозою Трамп. Чому раптом питання України стало суперечливим для нього і для його команди, якою очікувати його політику щодо України і якою буде політика Камали Гарріс, тому що окей, був Байден, але це вона інша людина, ми менше знаємо про неї. Наскільки взагалі домінує в Сполучених Штатах думка про потребу якихось переговорів України з Росією. І загалом я запитувала про фактори, які зіграють, про що ці вибори, за якими питаннями слідкувати, які є суперечливими, чи це питання в явці, спойлер швидше за все, наприклад, яким може бути спадок Байдена, і коротенько навіть про те, що який може бути сценарій, якщо раптом умовно Трамп не визнає поразку на своїх виборах, що це буде, чому раптом Кремнієва долина підтримала Трампа, Ілон Маск став його активним прихильником. Це теж таке інтерв'ю, більш інформативне, такий трошечки креш-курс американо-українських відносин і того, за чим слідкувати на виборах. Такі базові питання, як то знаєш, кажуть, як буває Q&A, ключові питання, оце вони і є. Думаю, що ми постаралися викласти перед тим, як детальніше перейти вже до якихось речей, які можна буде зрозуміти швидше, до дати. Вибори у Сполучених Штатах завжди відбуваються у другий вівторок листопада. Цього разу це буде 5 листопада.
Окей, непогана підготовка до виборів. Ми розуміємо, що з виборів, з Штатів ти привезеш немало матеріалу, але я одразу скажу, що мені найцікавіше буде послухати тебе, але про це ми окремо розкажемо. Що ж, давайте слухати розмову Наталки з Крістіаном Керолом, редактором, журналістом. Поїхали!
Christian, such a pleasure to have you here in Kyiv, in Ukraine. We were usually in touch when you were in your desk in Washington, D.C., but now you're here for some time. Can you maybe first explain how come the
American editor, former editor of Washington Post, now, is now in here.
Well, at the end of last year, the Washington Post gave me a lot of money to leave, and I wanted to try some new things, so I left. I was very sad about it, but I'm actually very happy about it. I've been having a great time. I've been doing all sorts of different things, working on books and doing journalism, and now I'm here in Kiev teaching at the Kiev School of Economics. I just completed a short course on how to write an opinion piece for the American newspaper. And this coming week, I'm going to be doing a course on disinformation. And I'm also doing a guest lecture on propaganda. And I want to talk about why the most effective propaganda is entertainment.
I would still ask, you mentioned you had the funds after, ending your career at Washington Post, but going on for the books. But it's not an obvious case. You can have, the time in a nice island elsewhere and calmly writing the books, but you're here in autumn in Ukraine. And, you are not really a Ukrainian with a root, so you have never been posted here permanently. So why?
That's a fantastic question. I think the answer is very simple. I'm what we call in America an old fart. I'm an older guy. I don't think I would have ever picked up a gun, probably, but I'm definitely too old to be of any use in any kind of fighting role. But I feel very, very strongly in favor of Ukraine and wanted to do something to help Ukraine. And I've been here many times over the years. I was here last year in the spring, and it was very clear to me that Kiev has become a really fantastic place to just hang out and do work and meet people, and it's really quite safe. One of my friends heard that I was coming here and he said, "Oh, I'm just thinking of you over there in war-torn Kiev." And I had to explain to him that it's not really war-torn at all. There are parts of Ukraine that are absolutely devastated. I'm not minimizing that. But Kiev is actually a very inspiring place, precisely in my view, because people are getting on with their lives and showing that they can still live more or less normally. And that's a statement, I think. But I just love the city. I love hanging out with people in Ukraine. And I would much rather be hanging out here than in Washington, which is a rather dull place, to be honest.
So thank you for this care about Ukraine. We're speaking in the time of the very, very active time of the campaign for the elections of the U.S. president. Why Ukraine became more kind of a factor and a polarized issue? Can you just really explain? Because, at the early stage of the full-scale invasion, there was no doubt the Democrats and the Republicans were supporting Ukraine. I would get calls, from the people from Fox News, from even very conservative. We always appreciated this bipartisan support and kind of understood that, for particularly for the Republicans, there is a tradition of a particular Reagan tradition and tradition before, also this idea about the liberty fight. So, and then gradually, let's say that, this kind of changed, and for a considerable period of time, it's the issue which is debated. It unfortunately became the factor of inner policy, which is kind of played around. So how would you explain that, why we got to the point where we are?
I think there are two reasons. And I would put it this way. I would say one of them is real and the other one is kind of fake. And the real issue is that America, as you know, fought these two really, really horrible wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We spent literally trillions of dollars on those two wars, and neither of those wars ended very satisfactorily. And those wars coincided with the financial crisis in America. They coincided with all sorts of other things going on, issues with migration and other stuff. And a lot of the people, by the way, doing the fighting came from very traditional conservative parts of the country. And the people who were running policy at the time did not necessarily come from conservative traditional parts of the country and quite often didn't have military backgrounds. So there was a perception that the people fighting these wars were traditional people from the heartland, from Ohio and Texas and places like that. So there was a real sense of disillusionment over those wars. When Obama came in, one of his most effective slogans was, "Let's do nation building here at home." People have forgotten that now. Nation building here at home, because, Bush had been talking about nation building in Afghanistan and Iraq. People were sick of it. And that feeling has lingered. It went away for a little bit at the moment of the invasion, but as we spent more and more money supporting Ukraine at a time when a lot of Americans felt they were suffering economically due to high inflation and COVID and all those other things, it was very easy to play on that emotion. Why are we, and I've been seeing it a lot lately, why the hell are we spending my tax dollars on these people in a country I don't even know about when, I can't pay my mortgage? So that's a real factor. And that's a factor, I think, that's very tricky and difficult and, hard for Ukraine to deal with. But it's a real thing. The second thing that I would call more fictitious is Donald Trump. So Donald Trump has a personal vendetta against Ukraine. He believes that Ukraine and Zelensky were directly responsible for the first impeachment proceedings against him. As we've learned in some recent reporting, he genuinely believes, or at least he says all the time, you never know what he genuinely believes because you can't separate that from his rhetoric, but he believes that, Ukrainians tried to sabotage his election in 2016 or 2020. It kind of varies depending on what he's talking about. So he actually has a kind of personal vendetta against Ukraine, and then, which I think is largely based on things that are just in his head. I don't think Zelensky was opposed to Trump in any way. He just resisted being blackmailed by President Trump into doing certain things that weren't necessarily true. And then there's the factor, part of this fictitious second criterion that I'm talking about is Trump's really astonishing love for Putin, which we continue to get new reporting on that. Bob Woodward has this new book out about Trump, and we've learned just within the past few days that Trump called Putin a number of times after he ceased being president, and they had these delightful, friendly conversations. And, Trump at one point asked someone at his club to leave the room because he was about to have a confidential conversation with Vladimir Putin. And all that, of course, explains a lot because Trump has this tremendous fondness, it would seem, for dictators and strongmen. He believes that they're real guys. And his strongest affection really seems to be for Vladimir Putin. And to me, it's kind of a nightmare. It's very, very strange. We've never seen anything like this. You might recall he had a meeting with Putin where reporter in Helsinki, notoriously, when he was president. And the reporter said, well, the intelligence agencies have issued a concurrent opinion that Russia interfered in the 2016 election. Do you believe them or do you believe Vladimir Putin? And he said, I believe Vladimir Putin. So that, I think, cannot be written. That is just a huge, huge thing. And when Trump says something, his supporters believe it. So if he says Ukraine is bad and nefarious and we shouldn't help Ukraine, he hasn't said it quite that directly in the past few weeks, his supporters take that very, very seriously.
I probably would like to clarify because you said sometimes it varies what Trump says. Because I remember reporting 2020 elections and it was still Trump in the office. So, Ukrainians were pretty cautious with the Republicans. They kind of were playing carefully. And quite a few people admitted that somehow Ukraine managed to go, along this bipartisan line and don't kind of play, somehow succeeded in not getting too much into that because the risks were very high, because there was a pressure. That's one thing from at that time, Republican administrations to, investigate something which Ukrainian state shouldn't investigate. Or so when you're speaking about now kind of blaming Ukraine, it was not there at that time. Also later when, Ukraine was a hype story and the early stage of the war, Zelensky was the most popular person on earth. The Republicans were there. They were liking him. It was not like...
Trump was not in power, though.
Trump was not in power, but even kind of their supporters, they kind of as if they've forgotten that. So maybe you can also, for this audience, clarify where is, what is actually factual and what is not in this Ukraine or the Ukrainian government messed it up with Trump.
Well, look, Ukraine was not a giant issue in 2020, of course not. But, what was a giant issue in 2020? Hunter Biden. And Hunter Biden, in Trump's eyes, was the connection between the corrupt Ukrainian oligarchy and Joe Biden himself. And there are all these wild rumors and all this wild disinformation about Hunter Biden's activities with Burisma and, he was paid $5 million a month or this, that, and the other thing, crazy exaggerations and lies and falsehoods. And all that stuff has been steaming along in the background, right? Most Republicans are actually still in their hearts, if I can say that. People like even Lindsey Graham, those people are traditional Republicans who have a traditional Republican view of American foreign policy, which is that American foreign policy should be interventionist in certain situations, especially when it's a matter of defying our authoritarian enemies like China or Russia or North Korea, right? That there was a long-held consensus on that all through the Cold War, and to some extent after the Cold War. There was a consensus on the war against terror, right? Republicans were also very interventionist. So those people were still around in 2020, right? The other, really striking thing is that a lot of those people were in Trump's foreign policy apparatus, pushing for more support for Ukraine when Trump was president. So, they were the ones who wanted to send javelins to Ukraine, and they were the ones who wanted to support Ukraine, even during Trump's presidency. So all along, we've seen that divide to a certain degree between Trump and traditional Republicans. But I think as time has gone on, I think that his base, not the elite Republicans in Washington who still see the rationale for an active American engagement in the world, but Trump's base out in the heartland in various countries, they have largely, I think, absorbed Trump's notion that Ukraine is not something we need to be supporting.
But how about this message, which I hear from some of the conservative Ukrainians in the U.S., but also some of the, people who just don't like Democrats, saying that, but if it were Trump, it was the javelins who were delivered during the Trump administration. It's all up to the Obama who failed during the Crimea invasion. On that side, that if Trump was in the House, the Putin wouldn't dare.
Exactly. One hears those arguments all the time. All I would say is they are counterfactual because, Trump did not prevent. Putin was up to a lot of nefarious activity in Ukraine during Trump's term, was he not? And yes, there were individual officials who implemented very pro-Ukrainian policies. But Trump actually made it quite clear he was not entirely on board with those people. And one of the things we've seen from some of his preparations for his next term in office, if he wins, is that he is not going to allow multiplicity of views in his administration. He's going to be much more disciplined this time about the people he hires, and he's going to make sure that they implement the policies that he wants. So there are many Republicans who try to provide some kind of alibi for Trump's activities, right? His beliefs. And those are traditional Republicans trying to put lipstick on a pig, as we say in the United States, trying to make a bad situation look better. Yes, I've heard those same things, but Trump, I think, has been quite clear. If he becomes president, he will, that's one thing he's been very clear about, I think. Yeah. Day one, I will end the war. And it's quite clear what he means by that. The only way you can end the war in a day when you take office is by saying, all right, Ukraine, we're cutting off all aid. We're not going to help you anymore. You make a deal with Putin and that's it.
Unfortunately, that's exactly what I heard, that from various sources, that's what he says. It's not what is in his mind and somebody's guessing, but he admitted that he might. But I think that it's not the hope. We will speak about the elections and the result, but disregarding, you try to find some, not silver lining, but, just an idea that it's maybe wishful thinking. That would be the best term to say, is that even if sooner or later, for instance, with North Korea, Trump was very, very optimistic about negotiating with his pal Kim Jong-un. But in the end, they fought. It was a very cordial romance, and then all of a sudden everything collapsed because it didn't work. And that's even my humble thoughts would be that's maybe he has ideas how to deal with Putin, but in the end, that guy won't listen. And what we also know, there is no real close communication, a really proper established channels of communication between the Kremlin and Trump. So what he says, he listened to me, it's based on they're vicious, rather than like a real established agreement.
Well, that's it. I mean, one of the reasons why we see these contradictions that you were describing is that Trump doesn't really have actual policy ideas about foreign policy. He thinks that foreign policy is about bros, basically. He thinks that you get together with the powerful guys and you cut a deal. That's, I think, the extent of his real foreign policy philosophy. There's no actual intellectual, I hate to use that word, there's no actual, philosophical foundation for anything. It's just strong guys, strong leadership. You get together, you cut a deal, and you do what's good for America. I mean, I think that's about the extent of how deeply he thinks about foreign policy. So it's a completely personalized foreign policy. Guess what? Putin actually has very strongly stated philosophical ideas about foreign policy, which he's applied with great consistency throughout his career. He's thought a lot about foreign policy. Foreign policy is very important to him. And we know what his goals in Ukraine are. So Trump has the power to tell the Ukrainians I'm going to turn off the faucet now. He has the power to do that. He has zero leverage over Vladimir Putin, I think. So when Trump comes in and says, I'm ending the war on day one, that means he'll basically just throw open the field to Putin and Putin will do what he wants.
At this particular moment, Ukrainians are trying to, use the opportunity and work on something which is called the Biden legacy. At least I was told by the quite senior people in the Ukrainian foreign policy and the others that actually it was the President Biden who is very, very cautious about Ukraine's joining NATO. It's not somebody of his advisors whom we needed to persuade. It's exactly him in particular because he's coming from this Cold War time, the older guys who still would speak about the nuclear escalation. So if there would be somebody to persuade about NATO, that would be Biden. It was not at all possible because he maybe thought about the next term, but after it's clear that he won't be any longer in office, his foreign policy legacy is really problematic. It's Afghanistan, very unsuccessful pullover of the American troops and, overtaking the country with Taliban. The horrors in the Middle East, it's really bad. I mean, it's as bad as it was not for quite some time. And, so Ukraine gives a chance. That's the Ukrainian argument. So let's do at least something that your legacy would be different. So the discussion about, maybe some modalities about Ukraine joining the NATO, at least without foreign troops on the ground, but with particular principle, with some of the limitations. That's what I know. That's what I heard, although we don't know much details. Yet what would you say on, do you really think it's possible to have any kind of addition, like the Biden legacy and use this couple of months for something?
I don't think there's much hope of getting anything done in the next few months. I'm just an independent journalist. I'm not a member of the Democratic Party, I have to say. I'm not a member of I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not working for anyone. But I think objectively speaking, the best option for Ukraine is that Kamala Harris wins. We don't know. Again, you're better informed than I am because you've been talking to lots of people who know about administration policy towards Ukraine. My sense is that she will take a fairly robust line on Ukraine. I think it's quite clear that if Trump comes into office again, there will be no talk of Ukraine joining NATO. I don't think it's only... the Americans, of course, are absolutely vital. I think the other thing Ukraine has to worry about has nothing to do with the general election in the United States, which is the Germans. The French are on board with Ukraine and NATO. The Poles are on board with Ukraine and NATO. The Brits are on board, seem to be on board with Ukraine and NATO. The Germans are not. At least they are hesitating. They're hedging. And that is also quite huge. The coalition in Berlin is falling apart. And there will be elections in Germany within the foreseeable future. That's another thing Ukraine has to worry about. Not to change the subject, but it's not only about America.
But I do understand how consumed the U.S. is with the elections, with the issues which are critical now. But would you just maybe explain, or to extent the current position? I would tell to our audience what I kind of felt that, there are more discussions about some kind of the negotiations. We're debating, are these discussions, pushed from Ukraine, or they are pushed by the Ukrainian partners because saying look, you're not winning. you're losing. The situation in Pokrovsk is very bad. Yes, Kursk operation surprised a lot, but you didn't gain much, and you should understand that the foreign aid won't be bigger, it would be less and less, so the winter would be hard, so better now than later, because the situation in Ukraine is not really good, it's not very optimistic, so you need to think about. I shouldn't really express my opinion because in this regard, there is a lot of wishful thinking because it's coming from a very theoretical talk because we didn't have any sign from Russia to negotiate. And also where I see the problem in this discussion, which is very hard actually to tell while being also grateful for existing help, but also there is nothing offered to us as a guarantee. Okay, come that you need to negotiate, but at least some guarantee should be given, but it just it doesn't think like a reasonable fact-based talk, but just some kind of a wishful thinking. But what is your feeling? Because you were the editor in the Washington Post for quite some time, but I talked to the editors, and they're very specific people because they ask the questions which are asked by the audience. They're usually critical. So when I interact with American editors, I hear the same thing for quite a long time, all this kind of rather negative questions about more or less reconfirming their bias towards something should be done, maybe. To your opinion, what is this kind of general mood in the US regarding the Ukraine and the end of the war, or at least negotiations? Yeah, let's honestly speak, the mood in Washington.
Okay, the mood in
I don't know
Washington.
what Washington is, to be honest, at this stage, but, I think it's fairly transferred to me through various editors, and it's pretty consistent for quite some time.
Yes. I mean, there is a very widespread view, first of all, let's try to break it down a little bit, that Ukraine cannot win. Okay? There was the summer offensive. More recently, Ukraine has been, pushing really hard to just maintain what it has. And then the Kursk offensive, which has been, I think, productive in some ways, and in other ways leaves a lot of questions open, right? What was the strategic purpose? Was it really a great idea to put resources into that? So I think the first issue is, can Ukraine win? I think there's a great deal of skepticism about that. I think that people are, like me, I'm just shocked and astonished that Ukraine has managed to stick it out for so long against such an overwhelming enemy. And I think that is a tremendous testament to Ukraine's resilience and ingenuity and fighting spirit. But unfortunately, the past year or so has not been, that overall that encouraging, although there have been some amazing successes. So I think, first of all, there's that idea that it's hard to imagine a scenario in which Ukraine just outright wins. So then, number two, the issue becomes what sort of situation brings the fighting to a halt in a way that doesn't negate Ukraine's achievements on the battlefield thus far and doesn't negate all that money that the Western allies put into this whole undertaking. And the version that I think I hear people saying a lot is you sort of agree to freeze, and I'm just repeating what I'm hearing, you agree to sort of freeze the forces in place where they are. Russia agrees not to attack anymore. Its gains are not formally recognized in any way, but also Russia does not agree to give up anything that it already has. And the thing that you give Ukraine in turn is NATO membership or some other kind of really, really expansive security guarantee. And then you sort of freeze the conflict in place, like Ukrainians have been hearing that word freeze, right? But then the number 3 point is one that I think our mutual friend Ann Applebaum made very well in her recent essay in The Atlantic, which I recommend to all of your readers. I think it's one of the best ones I've seen so far, is precisely what you were saying earlier. Putin has not given any sign he wants to negotiate. Putin hasn't expressed any interest in any talks whatsoever. Putin still denies that Ukraine is a state, which is something that he once whispered to George W. Bush back in 2008 in Bucharest, apparently. He doesn't see any reason to just settle for things the way they are. So that's a kind of daunting constraint, I think. And that's the one that I don't really see people in Washington mentioning when they talk about this hopeful scenario of sort of freezing things in place, but giving Ukraine something in return for all that all that it's managed to sacrifice so far.
What to expect from the foreign policy of Kamala Harris regarding Ukraine? Because that's what I kind of tried to figure out so far. First, we knew that there was kind of more personal connection of Biden to Ukraine. He was here for a long time.
Exactly.
He's a Cold War time person for whom Eastern Europe matters, Russia matters, and that's one thing. But also he kept coming since, I don't know, when he was a vice president of Obama. He was here, right after the Euromaidan revolution and met so many people. So there is something dear to his heart. It's really, in the end personal, and there was this also in the end the relations. Kamala is a person of a new type for whom, Cold War is far away. It's a new generation of the American Democrats, which is looking to the world differently. It's not any longer the Russia in the center, so many other. But also, we couldn't really figure out, what is her position on Ukraine before. As I was said, that's the job of the vice president, not to stand out. So, in fact, like what we all knew was kind of told by the administration. So we don't know, there are particular names, but we don't really understand her. And also the concern is that, okay, she doesn't have this personal touch, personal investment. So even if she might be determined, doesn't look like she'll care a lot. What would you say on that?
Well, I'll have to be honest. Look, I'm not a White House reporter. I don't report on the White House at all. I never have. I know what you know. You probably know more because you actually talk to people who are doing Ukraine policy. I know what I get from my newspaper reading and my friends. Yeah, very basic. She's a blank slate to me on Ukraine. I can't really detect. I don't know what her Ukraine policy is. She said she's going to be very tough. That's kind of it. We don't really know. I don't know. I don't have a clue. I know some of the people who have advised her, who are very traditional Democratic foreign policy experts. You probably know them too. They seem to me just to be in exactly the same space that Biden and his national security people have been in. But that's all I can tell you. We really don't know. I suspect, given that she is a foreign policy neophyte of sorts, I mean, let's be frank, that's what she is. As you rightly said, we haven't really seen her doing a lot on foreign policy at all, and we certainly haven't seen her traveling to Ukraine during her time as vice president. She doesn't have the same personal investment. So I think it's got to fall somewhere within the traditional confines of democratic foreign policy towards Ukraine, which I think is don't let Putin win, but ... It's certainly, I can state with a high degree of probability, it'll be better than Trump. But you mentioned a lot of, I think very important data points about kind of the sense of fatigue among Washington policymakers. One of the things we haven't mentioned at all is Israel and Gaza and Hezbollah. That is taking up a gigantic amount of logistical and emotional and organizational bandwidth in Washington. And Ukraine is now kind of in a state of competition with that. And, there are a number of very important domestic constituencies that have stakes in that conflict. And that's sucking, I hate to use the tired metaphor, but that really is sucking oxygen out of the room for Ukraine.
Yeah, that's clear. But I'll be honest, as a Ukrainian, I would say it's kind of fair. What's going on in the Middle East, it's so wild at this stage.
And
that
huge and scary.
It's huge and scary that it should be taken care. So it's not like, they're thinking about something less important than what is important here. It's equally important because,
right.
So in a way, I don't feel the competition. We need to accept that. And that would be my point on this regard, because it's indeed serious. You cannot underestimate what's going on. Even not just about October 7th, but about Lebanon, about Nasrallah, who was there forever, So it's a very, very big thing. Still, yes, you're not a White House correspondent, yet you're an American journalist, pretty much following your news. It's your country, your elections. So we still, in general, would like to say, but what is a Kamala Harris as a politician? I would stress that what we know from her, she's a former prosecutor. And I remember a very nice, interesting talk with a senior South Korean editor they have a tradition of having prosecutors becoming, leaders of the states. And they said like, oh, we know what it is. These people usually think they're always right and look at everybody with a suspicion. And I thought like, that's actually quite a thing, But that's why, people think that, okay, the quote everybody liked about her when she was speaking about Putin, that, like she dealt with the bullets, she dealt with the bad guys. She know you shouldn't play with them because you really should stop them.
Come after you, yeah.
So, that approach, it's pretty, likable in our case. But generally, what is she? Where would be her priorities?
I think one of the things I would say, first of all, is that she is extremely ruthless. I remember a few years ago when she was in the Senate, there was a congressional hearing. Maybe you remember which one it was. And she was absolutely brutal as an interrogator, as a questioner in this Senate hearing. Very prosecutorial. And it was very impressive. I remember being very struck by how tough and no holds barred she was. And I think that's not to be underestimated. That's a very, very important skill. It's very hard for me to say what her priorities are going to be. I think she's going to try to get on top of the economy. I think that's going to be number one. I think she's going to do whatever she can to keep the economy going. She has these rather populist proposals about containing inflation, which don't actually sound like very sensible policies to me, but if she can strike that populist note and keep it going, I think that might engage a lot of her, her base. It could be very successful. I mean, people tend to forget what a populist Biden was economically, and it actually worked out fairly well for him. Despite the inflation thing, I would argue, the economy is actually doing quite well. One of the things I think is very sad is that you don't get credit in politics for the things you prevented. And people forget that during the pandemic, we were all expecting a recession. We were expecting the pandemic to lead to an actual, fairly serious downturn in the economy. And actually, Biden managed to keep the economy more or less stable with a lot of problems, inflation being one. But, the market stayed fairly strong. Employment stayed surprisingly strong. And as soon as the pandemic started to ease off, employment just boomed. And employment is great right now, just added a bunch more jobs. The economic data are actually quite positive. And then the question becomes, and you and I were talking about this the other day, how do you bring that to bear on the people who believe that America is in a state of chaos and collapse, as Donald Trump is always saying? Because when that attitude, when that belief establishes itself, it's very hard to get rid of. So I think one of her challenges, her biggest challenge, is going to be somehow to make those economic gains pay off for her. Biden somehow was not very successful at doing that. He wasn't very good at advertising his successes where he had successes. She might do a better job of that. And I suspect about 80% of her first term, if she wins, will be about that.
By the way, would she be vice president if not Biden stepped out, if there would be really a different process with the primaries? Because it's also very unprecedented.
I don't know. That's a great question. It really didn't feel very satisfying. Again, I'm an independent. I'm not a Democrat or Republican. It didn't feel terribly democratic to me. It felt more like a succession, like a royal. The Tsar abdicates and puts his daughter into the succession. That's what it felt like.
Who knows? Maybe at this stage, maybe that would be more difficult for a woman of color to become a white president at this particular still moment of history.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah.
So maybe that's a moment that it was a chance.
Look, I'm very skeptical. I don't ascribe to all this Kamala hysteria, which was a little bit fake in my view. Now that's clearly starting to taper off. The honeymoon is over. I have my concerns. I'm very skeptical. I'm not a cheerleading Democrat. Tell you one thing, though, she is so much better than Hillary Clinton. I thought Hillary Clinton was everything you didn't want in a candidate. I thought she was an absolutely terrible candidate. I thought she was going to win like everybody else. I subscribed to the conventional wisdom in 2016.
I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't believe she would win.
Yeah, you were talking to more people than I was.
Yeah, the people just were outside of New York and Washington.
Yeah. Why was she a terrible candidate? Widely hated, for, I think, her personality.
Okay.
I mean, I met her once in person and I found her absolutely awful. You know, she was not a person of empathy and warmth. She was a person who'd gone through a very tumultuous, brutal political path. And I think that closed her, her husband's scandals and everything. And I think that just closed her off completely as a person. I think she was absolutely not warm and not the kind of person you would want to have a beer with. I thought she was wooden. I thought that she still had a lot of baggage from the Clinton presidency. He was going to make her healthcare czar at one point, and then there was kind of a huge grassroots protest, like nobody voted for this woman. You're going to put her in charge of 15% of the U.S. economy. There were a whole series of things. I mean, she was just a bad candidate. I found her speeches uninspiring, unbelievably boring, and her policy positions, the 80 pages of policy positions carefully calibrated to each constituency of the Democratic Party. It was basically like everything that we don't like about the Democratic Party, pandering to each little group.
So what's different with Kamala?
Kamala is very charismatic, actually, I think. She seems like a human being. She has a goofy laugh. I don't think that's a shortcoming. I think that's actually helpful. She has a lot of energy, and she comes off as quite tough. All of this may rub off in the first month if she's elected, of course, but I think there are reasons why she enjoyed such a bounce when she became.
I had the chance to be in the round table with the senior editors, including the Americans, who were discussing the situation prior to the elections. And, they were all complaining how less substance is in these elections, like zero, because at least in 2008, there was economic crisis, healthcare, then something. Some would argue that, quite some time, there is little substance in a lot of elections globally, and that's something to accept. But I still would kind of divide my question in two. So what is these elections are really about, if we speak about the substance or issues which are, the most debated, the most discussed? And secondly, what I was explaining, that no, the question actually is not about what is debated, but about the turnout, whether the young people would come, whether the Muslims who could support Democrats wouldn't come because they're so disappointed about the U.S. current policy towards Israel. So they just wouldn't come, wouldn't show up in like states like Michigan, or some other people, like young people are not voting. Some people saying like they can be very energetic, but they are not coming to the polls. Yes, turnout. And yes, what are the campaign issues?
Yeah, see, I think that's a wonderful question. We love to talk about ideology, and about political issues. We tend to talk less about the technology of campaigning, how you actually do it. I'll leave issues aside for the moment because I think it's actually, for your hearers, it's worth talking about the other thing, the more technical side. What's really fascinating about this campaign is that the two candidates are running entirely different kinds of campaign. And it's very simple. Trump wins if he can get his prospects are based on low propensity voters, people who don't tend to vote. The people who like him are people who don't actually tend to go to the voting booth. Kamala Harris's voters are high propensity voters. They are geared up. They tend to be people who like to vote. They're very concerned about politics. So her strategy is very much a traditional strategy of what we call the ground game. You have regional field offices. She has thousands of them all across the country. The Democratic Party has a field office in a medium-sized city. They have all these people who go out. Their job is to give people yard signs and leaflets and brochures and to go out and canvass, to go out where there are voters and talk to them, knock on their doors, and if necessary, on Election Day, drive them to the polls, make sure they get to the polls. So the traditional American turnout operation, that's what she's focusing on. She has to worry about two constituencies, black men and moderate Republicans. She just made a big appearance in Wisconsin, a key battleground state. I don't need to explain what that means. With Liz Cheney, who is a famous Republican from a famous Republican family who favored impeaching Trump and was destroyed politically for it. So she was trying to appeal to moderate Republicans. And black men, they're actually the one segment of her potential electorate who are low propensity voters. So she's got to get them off their butts. get them to the polls, get them activated. Trump has an entirely different challenge. He has to get people to vote who normally might not really want to go to the trouble, who are just kind of apathetic and not that political. And so he has completely discarded the traditional political operation. Instead of having regional field offices run by the Republican Party, he's largely just dispensed with that. And he's outsourced a lot of his campaigning to a variety of private Republican organizations. And what they're trying to do is they're going to all sorts of rather unlikely places. And they have these apps and enormous databases. They're trying to find those low propensity voters, try to persuade them to actually act on their principles and vote for President Trump. It's very risky. It could work, but in 2020, where they applied that, it didn't work very well. In 2022, where they applied that, it didn't work very well. And now they're doing it really on a national scale. So instead of having people going to the places you would expect, those key counties in Pennsylvania, having them walk the streets, knock on doors, hand out information, telling people where to go to vote, they're not doing any of that. They're doing something completely different. And you see Trump, for example, going on podcasts and streamer channels, influencers. He had a very successful meeting, which they then turned into a TikTok ad with Logan Paul, this famous young influencer who's what we would call a bro. He's like a very kind of aggressive young man who's like kind of conservative and nasty and rather, has a gigantic following of young men. And so Trump is trying to activate those people. He wants them to come to the polls. He's doing anything he can to get them active, but it's a very difficult strategy to execute.
How come that quite a few libertarians and the Silicon Valley people openly supported Trump? Because there was this idea that, this Silicon Valley is Democrats, all these things. Trump bashed a lot of them. The people like Elon Musk, they remained somehow, you could guess, but they remained vague about that. But yes, Mark Zuckerberg is different, but he said he's kind of libertarian recently, whatever it means. But Elon Musk openly supports Trump. It's not like he was critical to Kamala. But now, some of the people in Silicon Valley became openly supportive after everything which has happened, after January 6th. So, it's a different moment. How would you explain that? And also the Elon Musk in that position?
Most of Silicon Valley, I think, is firmly Democratic. But these people like Elon Musk and in particular Peter Thiel,
Could explain who is Peter Thiel?
Peter Thiel is an American tech tycoon and venture capitalist who he describes himself as a libertarian and has expressed doubts that democratic systems are the best way to guarantee personal freedom. He's very skeptical of kind of traditional liberal democracy. And I think there's a kind of, what would you call it, a kind of hyper-meritocratic element in Silicon Valley. I think Musk is very much that. Hey, I made $1 billion, get out of my way. You can tell me what to do when you make your $1 billion. If you haven't made $1 billion, you don't have the same rights that I have. I'm just going to trample all over you. That's the impression he always gives me, that he thinks it's the world should be run by the people who have succeeded at making lots of money. And his conversion to Trumpism, remember, has been actually fairly recent. And in his case, it had to do with a very personal, or at least he says, with a very personal reason, which was that one of his children decided to change their gender. His son became a woman and is now a woman. He has said that was the thing that made me change my political orientation. I used to be not so concerned, and then I realized that the woke mind virus, the sort of virus of political correctness
woke is the term which is used for
the progressive ideal of diversity, equity, and inclusion, basically all of that stuff. Wokeness. He calls it the woke mind virus, which I think is really quite an amazing coinage. Some kind of personal factors may have entered into it, but basically I think, we see a lot of billionaires supporting Trump. And Trump has said quite openly, to the oil industry, for example, I'm going to help you get richer. Give me your support and I'll make sure that you get all the tax breaks and benefits you want. So there is a kind of oligarchic moment there, I would say.
why, after the insurrection of January 6th and a lot of other trials, so many Republicans and so many Trump voters are still with him. Because if we would talk 2 years before, that would be still a question. Would he make it? Now we're in a position when we're speaking seriously. If he win, probably we shouldn't have been surprised 2 years ago. But still, like, kind of this blindness of what had happened in the past, why it's like for quite a chunk of the U.S. populations.
It's because Trump can do no wrong for supporters. It's that simple. It's a kind of cult. People have short memories. If they want to forget something, they'll forget it. Well, who was that? There was a Republican Party official who was speaking to a group of American expat voters in the UK recently, I think it was. It was an amazing video. And she said, well, I'm not really a Trump supporter, she said, but you know what happened on January 6th? It was very regrettable. It was just sort of a rally that got out of control. It was just an unfortunate event where a bunch of people came together. They were very angry and they just kind of lost control. Very sad. And the whole idea that Trump might have actually incited this riot or instigated it in some way, which he clearly did, just kind of fell by the wayside. And I think that's the way you see a lot of Republicans rationalizing their views on that particular event. But it really ultimately just comes down to the fact that Trump is very popular with a large segment of Republican voters. If he tells them there was voter fraud, even though there wasn't, now, what is it? 2/3 of Republicans believe there was voter fraud. If he tells them that January 6th was just some people who got emotional, and I had nothing to do with it, as Trump recently said in one of his appearances, they'll believe that. If he says that Ukraine tried to help, Hillary Clinton get elected in 2016 with a secret DNC, Democratic National Committee server hidden in Ukraine, they'll believe that. If Zelensky, I don't think he actually said it, but people in his surroundings said, the whole thing about Zelensky having several yachts because he's so corrupt. If Trump says that, his supporters will believe it. They believe what he tells them to believe. It's very frightening.
I'm not a big fan of guessing, but it's rather than planning. I'm boarding. We're speaking of the day, and the next day I'm boarding the flight. I'm going to America, and then later, by the moment this podcast is on air, I'm already there. So there would be more coverage about what's happening in the U.S. During the elections and after. But I would like to finish maybe with kind of your editorial knowledge and explanation of what actually can happen next with the challenging of the elections and what is the procedure. Because a lot of people here probably can't understand that, it's not really like here you have exit polls, 10 a.m., we know everything. By the next morning, the Electoral Commission has counted the votes and that's it. In the US, I remember last time, there were protests, but there is also a very lengthy process of submissions of electoral votes in every single county, in different date, and then there would be, a different procedure. So we expect that in case Kamala wins and Trump loses, he can say that it was fraud and things might happen. But what I understand would be kind of a longer process. So what do we expect in, November, December, January next year?
Well, you remember I talked about how Trump is not fighting the traditional campaign. A lot of the money that he is spending in his campaign is going to monitor polling places, even in places where Republicans traditionally win. Seems kind of wasted money. But he has this enormous operation of poll monitoring that he's setting up, and a legal operation to challenge poll results every single place he can possibly challenge them. So he's clearly gearing up. Last time when he said the vote was unfair, that there was fraud, he, had not really prepared that in advance. You remember how he called up the official in Georgia and said, I need whatever it was, 14,000 votes, right? That was kind of improvisation. He's not going to improvise this time. He's preparing all of that well in advance. So we can expect there will be days and weeks and months of lawsuits and legal challenges and litigation. It is going to be horribly ugly unless Kamala beats him by, 5% in every battleground state. And that's highly unlikely to happen. So it's going to be very, very ugly. And I, for one, nobody likes to talk about this, but I really do not exclude the possibility of violence. I think we could see a lot of violence, unfortunately, in the aftermath of this American election. If we don't, I am so happy to be proven wrong. But I think it's a possibility.
I'm usually not like finishing always on the negative note, but I would ensure there would be more coverage from the US elections from me. So it's not the end note in our reporting. Thank you for this talk. And we wanted to speak about the elections, of course, but I want also to give a chance. You explained what you're doing here. Thank you for coming. You explained your cause. But just shortly, this time, by being quite few weeks here, this maybe more difficult moment, maybe less hopeful moment for us, where people are more tired. What are you looking at? What is still, inspiring you, but maybe brings concern to you here in Ukraine, in Kyiv?
Well, I think on the positive side, I'm impressed by how energized people still are. There's definitely some fatigue, but when you ask people what kind of compromises do you want to make with the Russians, they don't want to hear that. They do not want to hear that word. I had one taxi driver, I'm sorry to quote a taxi driver like a lazy foreign correspondent, but it was very impressive. I said, so, how do you think it's going? And he went on for 20 minutes and he said, we're not giving up. There's no way we're going to give up. If our allies sell us out, we'll just go to the woods. And, it took until 1956 for the Soviets to completely suppress all of the guerrillas who were fighting against Soviet rule in Western Ukraine. We'll just do that again, and it'll go on forever because we're not giving up. And then, I read all these articles in the Washington Press talking about how fatigued people were and how they were the implication was they're kind of ready to give up. They want an end to the war. And, of course, I detect that as well, but that doesn't mean, I think it's wrong to say people are tired and they want an end to the war and to deduce from that they're ready to, let Putin win. Those two things don't actually go together. I think it's very important to emphasize that.
I'm, as always, the biggest optimist in the room, often always say, the things would be worse, but we are still pretty okay, so the road down is still long, so we have something to keep us.
I think that's true. And Putin, we don't talk enough about the weakness of the Russian economy, about how much blood and treasure Putin has had to expend to retain these modest gains that he's retained. We need to be talking about that a little bit more.
So thank you so much for your talk, for the discussions, and for a lot of insights. But first of all, for being with us here, for you being very, very devoted. It's not taken for granted. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, it doesn't matter whether it's taken for granted or not. I wanted to be here, and I'm here.